Okay, Barbara, I don't know how long it's taken us to organize this podcast with you. It's been some years since you finished your dissertation, hasn't it? I
Indeed.
think we talked about it, but why has it taken us so long?
Well, probably because there's been a bit of work in between as well and a bit of development. So we can talk about that and all the development that came afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think there was a limit to how much you were able to talk about your project at the time, but delighted that we have you finally on the sales transformation podcast series. Um, just to briefly explain, maybe for the listeners as well, is that we have a subsection of the sales transformation podcast series called the Masterclass series, and this is where we invite our alumni to share their research topics. And so Barbara, who's an alumni of the MSc program in leading sales transformation, um, is here talking about her dissertation and her journey. So Barbara, it's just fabulous to have you on the show, so to speak. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Barbara, I just wonder, for the benefit of the listeners, if you could just give a short potted outline of who you are and how you've come to sort of get into sales and sales leadership. So I wonder if you can just give us a little bit of insight into your background before we get started.
Sure. And my current position is of transition at the moment. So I am a partner in a consultancy organization, and I have been working in sales approximately over the last, I would say, 20 years in different forms. So more recently, I've been working in consulting. Prior to that, I was working in technology sales and cloud sales as well, leading teams, and obviously as an individual contributor as well. That's how I started. And prior to sales in technology, I was in sales in financial services. So across different industries, I have carried that sales flag, and I
Right.
have developed different sales approaches, I would say. I wouldn't necessarily call them techniques, I would say more approaches and natural ways of working within sales and developing the specialization of sales.
Okay, so I know that you've got a very strong, you mentioned it earlier, sort of financial services background, and that's kind of is that been the sort of foundation in a way, the industry that you're in. So when you moved into technology sales and into consulting, has it been that sort of vertical market that you've sort of specialized in throughout your career, or have you sort of focused on other markets as well?
Primarily, I focused on financial services simply because I have that experience as a practitioner within financial services, within the business, within
Yeah.
the operational side of the business. So having had that first-hand experience has served me very well throughout all my roles. And when I moved to technology and when I moved to consultancy, I was very much focused on financial services.
Okay. So now I know you're located in Singapore, but has it been, Singapore been your base or your career?
I've been based in Singapore over the last 12 years.
Okay.
Prior to Singapore, I was based in the UK. However, I was traveling for work very often indeed. So I've worked for organizations which were based in London, but also in Europe. And I had interactions with Asia before moving to Asia as well. So I've had so much exposure across the European market as well, and prior to that, to the US market. So it has been a very wide exposure.
And okay, so you've been had very different roles within the financial services sector, then other companies, and then of course you embarked on the master's program whilst you were working with SAP. What prompted you to decide to do the master's program?
It was about it was a time when we were talking about development and personal development, professional development, and the topic of the master's program for, I think, the first time was sales transformation. And I thought that it was an incredibly interesting subject to develop because sales is seen as a profession, but at times it is misunderstood. So what I wanted to do is delve deeper into the qualities and the attributes of the transformational journey of sales professionals.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. So what we're here to do for this podcast is to talk about initially your sort of final dissertation, and the title of your final dissertation was Cultural and Emotional Barriers Which Causes Resistance to Change. And I would like to start off with why that particular topic? Why was that of such concern for you, Barbara?
Because I have seen a lot of transformation programs fail, not because of technology, not because of processes, but because of people. Because of the disconnect between the leadership drive and direction and the emotional drive and the emotional connection of the people within the organization. And the reason why I titled my project Cultural and Emotional is because they're very linked. So there are certain cultures that are more traditional and whereby innovation and transformation is seen as a threat. And the emotional side comes in and drives behaviors which are not necessarily rational and in line with the professional environment that we find ourselves in.
So just to provide just a bit more context, because at the time you did the dissertation, I believe you were based in Asia. So
Yes.
Would I be right in saying that the context of looking at this particular title was within that part of the world when you talk about culture, or was it something sort of broader than that, given that you've also worked in sort of Western European cultures as well?
It was, there were elements that looked outside of Asia, but the primary example was the transformation of traditional organizations within Asia and especially in Singapore. And I took a couple of financial institutions as an example and the transformation that they're still going through.
Okay. So the again, back to the context, the lens through which you were exploring this topic was more the sort of evidence of the ability to transform within some of the sort of organizations that you were consulting with at the time.
Exactly. So what I noticed during my interactions with these organizations is that culturally they wanted to transform, but culturally they were still stuck in a very traditional way of operating and in a very traditional style of leadership. So the transformation was only top down and it wasn't embraced because it was met with fear primarily. So these organizations have had people behaving in a certain way and counting on their competencies for years and years. And they found that, and the transformation found a lot of resistance because throughout the transformation, the workforce held on to the competencies and the traditional way of operating and found that they were being threatened and operated in fear rather than embracing or accepting that change. And if that cultural transformation is only led from the top by people who have not gone through a personal and professional transformation themselves, it's only going to be a transformation on the outside, and it's never really going to take deep into the roots of the organization. So those were my observations, and that's why I decided to write from a different angle, it's not about, an organization can adopt the most innovative technology, but if there is fear amongst the people who utilize that technology and there is resistance, then it's not going to be embraced or utilized.
I think it's such an interesting kind of topic, and you refer to the word fear, and I can see that very much as sort of it's quite a strong word, isn't it? Fear. I mean, it's and yet you talk about it in a lot of detail, and it's interesting that some of the early comments in your dissertation were about, sort of how routine, the role that routines have in innovation, and then you talk about sort of resistance is caused, by anxiety and fear of loss. And I think that, I don't know what the stats are, Barbara, but the percentage of transformation projects that fail, I believe, is running into the sort of 70% sort of level. I don't know if that's something that you've come across, but it's obviously a huge issue, isn't it?
It is. And the reason why I talk about fear is because there are two ways of operating. There is a way to accept that change is happening, and ambiguity is the status quo, and adapting to that. And I use the analogy of Lego. So instead of thinking about, oh, I am at risk of losing my job, or I'm at risk of losing my position, is the question should be, how do I put my knowledge, my competencies together in a different way? And the reason why I use Lego is that in the current professional world, we have to adapt and use the same components that have led us to where we are, but in a different combination, depending on the situation we're in, depending on the challenge that we're facing, depending on the organization we're in, and all these different circumstances. But I think changes happen so quickly that we have not been able to adapt and embrace the fact that change is now the constant.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to this in more detail, if I can talk about the way in which we address fear and this whole notion of resistance to change. But having identified your topic of interest, I'm interested to know about what were some of the inspirations in terms of the research you did on different literary sources, which kind of inspired you and influenced the way you began to look at this whole area of change and transformation. What were some of the most profound readings that you did as you went on your research journey?
I started reading literature, and I drew a parallel with The Leopard by Tommaso di Lampedusa. And first of all, because being Italian and of Italian origins, I connected very quickly with the culture, with the location, and also because I had read the book in my early years, during which I didn't pay the book the attention that it deserved. So I decided to read it again. And the reason why I drew inspiration from the book is because it talks about change. It talks about the emotional effect of change on the situation at the time. So the political situation was changing, the social situation was changing, but the individuals were almost in denial of the change. They were holding on to different traditions, different activities, almost ignoring that all this change was happening. And then they realized, they realized that this was happening, but only took consciousness of that change towards the end, when it was too late to then embrace it, and realize that they could have gone along with the change and learned from it. And those behaviors are applicable nowadays in the professional situations. So despite the fact that it depicts life in the Italian Risorgimento, I drew parallels between the reactions and the emotional turmoil at the time and the transformation and the pain of transformation that we are experiencing we have been experiencing throughout the last few years, and we are still experiencing. That was one.
Admit, yeah, yes, it's interesting, and I know that the leopard has been a source of inspiration for you for the chapter in the book that's coming out as well, of which you're one of the contributors. But we'll talk about that later. But I must admit, as I was reading your dissertation, I felt that you were drawing upon the pain and perhaps suffering, I don't know, Barbara, that you might have personally gone through in your life as you were, in your career, developing, with your family, as sort of moving from country to country, throwing yourselves into situations that were perhaps new and difficult at times. So I felt that as I was reading your dissertation, I was also getting a sense of the transformation that you personally have been on as you've sort of gone through your career. Would I be right in saying that?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because there is nothing I write that doesn't have that personal element, and it's a very strong personal element. So whilst I took inspiration from obviously literature and from some other books, the main inspiration is from the hands-on experience, because I do put myself through and willingly. So there is a lot of change in the professional world, but I put myself through a lot of change as well, and I changed career twice. So it has been quite challenging for me to adjust, quite challenging to accept. But also what I've done is I have personally led an introspection and personal transformation that is painful, but it's definitely leading to a lot of understanding of how change affects individuals. And only now that I'm through that transformation, I can't say that I've completed that transformation, because it's always work in progress. But only now I can look back and identify the tools that I have used, not knowingly at the time, to get through all the change that I have initiated and the change that was initiated by the circumstances.
Yes, I think you rightly said it, that sort of at the beginning, that the world in which we're now living is changing so much, and it's becoming less and less predictable, I think, and our ability to sort of be agile and adapt, to new situations is going to be, it is a critical competency, isn't it, for leaders, for managers, for individual contributors in the kind of business world, and it's the way in which individuals embrace change, which is so important. So it's very interesting how you sort of started to delve into the emotional side of change, because I think a lot of the sort of books around change and transformation that you can read, whether it's Kotter or some of the others, perhaps don't address the degree of, I don't know, the emotional impact of change to the extent that I think you've addressed it in your dissertation.
Indeed, all the books that I've read, and I read extensively throughout the project and prior to the project, we're addressing transformation from more of a process perspective. I wanted to delve deeper, and what I looked at is what is required to survive in the VUCA world, in this ambiguous and ever-changing situation we find ourselves in. So I started with, obviously, the concept of IQ, which is what most organizations would look for. And there is a strong search for EQ in leadership. But then I moved on to AQ, which is adaptability. And as you rightly said, just in the question earlier, is adaptability has become the most important skill for leaders. Because if they're not adaptable, how can they lead an organization that's going through uncharted territory? If they do not walk the talk, then how can they lead transformation and be credible? And that credibility, for me, it's hugely important. But that credibility is only built on authenticity. It's not built on a process. It's built on the emotional connection between all the different layers of an organization. And I like to, you mentioned earlier about the personal experience. Within a family, there are people who lead, and normally children follow. And then when children become teenagers, they tend to want to lead. So the roles sort of reverse, but there is very much an adaptability of how to deal with, the growing needs of a family, helping one another, collaborating to make sure that there is that progress through change. There is constant change throughout a family. And I like to look at that nucleus and see how is that emotionally transferable to an organization. I'm not saying that in an organization we would behave exactly the same way.
Yes.
But that authenticity, that willingness to grow together should be put in practice.
Okay, so just coming back to the approach you took with your dissertation, so the reason why you are so interested in this is because you've witnessed, if I could just quickly say, witnessed the pain of transformation challenges that some of your clients had faced, perhaps not going as well as it could have done. You began to sense this human element, this ability for individuals to deal with change and transformation, which comes back to anxiety and fear, which we spoke about sort of earlier on. But presumably what you did is, as part of your research process, you started to go out and not just base your theory on your own personal experience, but actually start to interview managers and people that took part in your research. So I wonder if you could just share how you then started to reach out to other people to get research data that then formed your sort of point of view at the end of the project.
Yes, sure. Now, because I was having numerous dealings with different clients, I reached out to executives within the companies I was working with. And I explained that I was doing a piece of research, and I was trying to understand why transformations, what barriers our transformations are presented with primarily. And I wanted to take a different angle. So I explained it, and they were all very interested in understanding why, because they found the topic relatively new and interesting. So I interviewed various executives from HR to functions and business, because I wanted to have an end-to-end understanding of the visibility that leaders across business functions and all the other different leadership positions head of what was going on within the organization. And some people were more connected than others. Some were completely detached. But the inputs that I got helped me understand why transformation journeys are not as successful as they are expected to be. And the inputs that I received were not only very useful, obviously, for the project itself, but to understand how I position myself as an advisor to the organization. So it served two purposes. And I really appreciate how open and honest these leaders were with me. And obviously, I asked, I asked whether they wanted to be quoted or not. They were very happy to be, because they felt that the research was a piece of new, like a new way of looking at the challenges, instead of just saying, oh, well, we're just going to focus on just the processes or the technology. There are three elements to every transformation: people, processes, and technology, and they're equally looked at, but the people side tends to drop at a certain point. Instead, that's the one that should be constantly monitored and constantly encouraged.
Yes, I was quite intrigued with part of your dissertation where you summarized an account of a conversation between yourself and an interviewee about this topic of being controversial. What I found interesting about the nature of your question, which was in a way it was quite controversial in itself. It's in your nature to be controversial, I think was a comment that you made. And you talked about that. And of course, you were responding to a sense that that's the way that the interviewee liked to be seen. But it's quite interesting about this, the ability to be able to ask questions that get provocative questions, perhaps that really get you the insights that could inform your point of view. And I was looking at the connection between controversy and challenge and this idea of fear of change, and whether this particular interviewee that I know that one of many, but was actually informing your point of view about the kind of practices that leaders were using to try and get people to accept change more than others. So I'm not sure if if I'm asking you a question at this point or just making an observation of your interview technique.
Yeah, I can expand a little bit on that, because obviously I have an incredibly good relationship with the person that I interviewed. And I could say, your nature is to be controversial. And the reason why I mentioned that is that actually the cultural background of the person that I interviewed is very fiery. The nature of the person is very fiery, and it comes from a culture where people do express their emotions, and they can express them freely without judgment, because the culture enables that. And they can express anger as well. But it now works in a culture where it's in a very, very placid culture, very traditional, very conservative. And I wanted to understand how it was positioning his nature versus being conscious of the cultural environment, and without losing the spark. So challenging without creating fear, because that challenge in a different cultural environment could create fear, which is what you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
How do you encourage challenge without and how do you create this psychologically safe environment where people do not feel fearful to challenge, and especially challenge different levels. And I interviewed some others instead, where they actually, and during the interview, they said, we don't feel that we can create that culture. And they felt that we're being intellectually dead because they were doing a job, but they were not being able to bring themselves to the bring all their skill sets as a person to the organization. So it's very much a balance, and it's very different styles of leadership. And I also interviewed different levels as well, just to understand the perception.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about fear, you talk about you know that, yeah, the fear of relevance. You talk about the fear of how you're perceived by others. It's quite interesting. I think you break it down in more detail in the book as well, the book chapter, sort of the different types of fear that you think people are kind of expressing, which which is interesting, but you also sort of connect this word fear with you talked about it just now, the sort of psychological safety. And the challenge of, I think, a great manager is going to be one that's able to create a climate where people feel safe, to do things, to make mistakes, perhaps, and so on. So I'm beginning to question in myself: is fear a bad thing or a good thing? I'll just give one scenario is that there is a sales director that I've worked quite closely with over the years, and he suffers from anxiety. And I think anxiety is one of the words that you've used in your research. And he had such high anxiety, he needed psychotherapy, to kind of sort it out. But he said what he's learned to do is use the anxiety that he has to create a high performance sort of culture. It's very supportive and caring, but he's actually been able to use that fear, which often we think of it as being a sort of negative thing, into something that's really quite positive. I get a feeling that that's what you're doing as you've written your dissertation. They're talking about the positive aspects of fear.
I actually do that indeed. And it's not just in my personal transformation, but I'm very open in my leadership style.
Yeah.
I'm very, yes, I'm very conscious of the fact that by admitting some of my challenges and the struggles, I can help others.
So, Barbara, part of your dissertation, you kind of referred to the importance of collaboration, and you also mentioned the work of David Wilkinson, who's someone that I've a huge amount of respect for as well. So, I wonder whether you could just elaborate a little bit on the role you think collaboration has in the process of dealing with change at a personal level.
Sure. And I really enjoyed reading and studying Wilkinson as well, because he talks about 5 types of leadership. And the type that I'm obviously more interested in, and that I found incredibly interesting and inspiring, was the generative leaders. Yeah. And again, that's where the collaboration piece comes in, because a leader is the way that he describes leadership is very much adaptable. A leader that brings in a different perspective, very innovative, and at times there was a little bit of trouble caused by this style of leadership. But because they bring in all these different elements and they bring everyone together towards the same objective and the same goal. And the collaboration that I'm talking about is being able to work towards the same without necessarily agreeing. Because and in one of the organizations that I worked for, we committed to, we disagreed and committed still, because there are many situations in which you don't necessarily agree with the course of action, with the decision that has been taken. But for the greater good of the organization and for the success of a specific project, then there is this commitment to still fulfill your role, support, and collaborate with the rest of the team, rather than sit back and say, oh, I'll watch this fail because I don't believe that it's going to succeed in this way.
Yes, and that links to this notion of purpose, which is again something you've identified as being from your research, one of the most important aspects of successful, I guess, change management is having all the people, I guess, engaged on a transformation project, sort of sharing the sense of purpose. Like you say, it enables you to collaborate perhaps in ways that you might not have collaborated before if you all share the same kind of goals. There's something that you mentioned, which is a really interesting concept, which is you talk about the current expectations and the concept of miswanting. And I must admit, I haven't come across that miswanting term before. And I wonder if you could expand a bit on what you meant by that.
Sure, and it's a term that I came across during the earlier part of COVID, because I was on various courses, and there were some courses on psychology and what makes people happy and what motivates people. And at times there is individuals don't really understand and see what is actually fulfilling in their professional and in their personal lives. So there is very much this mismatch of expectations and misunderstanding in terms of what do we really want from, let's say, what do we really want from a career? Do we want just a financial gain out of it? And then, let's be honest with ourselves, that is the purpose, right? But do we want to make a difference? Do we want to contribute to a change in society? Do we want to contribute to the community? And that needs to be identified. Because in my opinion, at times we hide behind different excuses, but the purpose is very different. And if you understand that purpose, then it makes life a lot easier, in the sense that we know what we should aim for. And there is a certain level of honesty and maturity in understanding that purpose, because it's not an easy in accepting what the right wanting is in those circumstances.
Yes, you make quite a bold statement here, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read this out, which is, I've realized that extreme pressure and expectations are put on executives to deliver. You say corporate society is creating a conceptual model of a leader which does not exist. We want our leaders to be strong, compassionate, trustworthy, to be universal beacons of justice and success. Aren't these opposites in most situations? And the list goes on, but these attributes can not be reflected in one person. Human beings are not only always strong, but their weaknesses make them humanely strong. Their vulnerability as leaders make them authentic and believable, and it makes them human like the rest of us. I think, it's really, it's a very strong kind of comment that you make, but it's absolutely correct. In my experience is there's huge pressure on expectations on execs to deliver, even though they may have an intent to be the best leader. They're not often given the space to do so. How much of this is to do with the way organizations are run, or how much of this is to do with, I don't know, individual preferences of how they believe a great leader should act? But, I think sometimes, the pressure simply drains the energy and space and time away from people to be great transformative leaders. It's interesting. I'm just going to carry on quoting an extract from your dissertation. Why are we trying to create heroes? Are we trying to create godlike figures because we as a corporate society need to defer our responsibilities to someone else? Do we need to attribute success or failure to someone else, as it's easier to pinpoint one individual to take responsibility for collective behaviors? Just very, I love the emotion in how you've written this, Barbara. It's really strong. So I want maybe in the next minutes that we have together, what were the conclusions you came to as a consequence of doing the research and exploring these topics? How's it changed you as a person as well?
It has changed very much my leadership style, because based on the comments and the research that I conducted, I realized that indeed we're trying to create this perfection in terms of the leadership style, this very polished leaders, when what we want is at times maybe just authenticity and real authenticity, not just a facade, but very a type of human being who cannot do everything. There are obviously limitations to what leaders can do. The pressure, the financial pressures which are put on these leaders are so strong that they actually change the approach. The best intentions at times are removed. And I remember quoting a leader who, when he joined the organization, he was talking about the North Star and how he wanted to bring this organization to become a lot more collaborative. And then he realized that the barriers were much greater than he had anticipated, and the challenges were just unsurmountable. So he could not really reach that North Star. And in the end, he just survived. He just accepted the fact that survival was the only mode he could operate in. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, it is intellectually and emotionally damaging to operate in that environment. And we've seen it more recently as well. And outside of financial services, I think in the world of fashion, we see that creative directors, and this is the most creative environment whereby creativity is encouraged rather than just financial pressure, are given just maybe a season or maximum two to increase profitability. And if profitability is not increased, then it's the hiring and firing. And there are cycles, obviously, in business, and it's not necessarily down to the individual. So that's my conclusion, really, based on the research and based on personal introspection, based on interviews, and a very holistic approach.
You talk about something called adaptive wisdom, which I think is a great term. And it seemed as though that was a kind of concluding comment as well. Could you define what you mean by adaptive wisdom?
I think it's accepting that certain things cannot change, but how do we adapt based on our experience and based on our learnings to the circumstances, but whilst we change what we can. So whilst we still go through, and I like the analogy of almost swimming in mud, right? It is very, obviously, it's very difficult, but there is still a way forward. And that's the wisdom that I derived from the analysis and the study and the research.
That's fantastic. Well, I found it a really interesting read, Barbara, and thank you so much for sharing it and sharing your research with us on the Sales Transformation podcast. Yes, I like one of the quotes that you've used on adaptive wisdom is that only one link of the chain of destiny can be handled at a time. I think that's a quote from Churchill. And I think that's what you were just saying, just then is that that whilst you're swimming in mud, I guess there's a limit to how much you can change, but taking it one step at a time is important. But sometimes difficult when the world is changing so quickly. One sort of rushes from one situation to another, perhaps sometimes too quickly, even. So, Barbara, thank you so much for the insights you've shared for us for the masterclass series of the Sales Transformation podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.